Invariably, when I think of baseball players, one of the first names that pops in my mind might surprise you. The name Joe. I think I've heard that name, and I'm wondering what the baseball connection might be. And it's quite a bit of an obscure reference. You know me, I'm the master of obscure references. But nevertheless, where is that name resonating in our memory, if it's even there at all? Anyone that read devotedly, as I did, Peanuts, the comic strip with Charlie Brown, would quickly remember Charlie Brown's inglorious baseball team. Remember, they never, ever won a game. We learned ultimately that he has a baseball hero whose name is Joe Slobotnik. If you Google him, you'll learn that he had a batting average of .004, one hit in his entire career. Just the kind of person Charlie Brown would look up to. And throughout different times in the script, there would be him hoping to go to an all-star event with Joe Slobotnik, going to an autograph signing, and he never really gets to be this baseball hero who is as hapless as he is. And that was the setup for something that more of you will remember. In the early 1980s, Miller Lite ran a commercial called Mr. Baseball. And in the commercial, Mr. Baseball's Bob Uecker, which did not immediately jump out at anyone except Milwaukee Brewers fans, since he's been a radio announcer and still is with the Milwaukee Brewers for now 4 decades. But he calls himself Mr. Baseball. He comes into the baseball stadium and he says, the front office has sent me tickets. And he moves down to the box seats at the lowest level in the stadium, and he's got his Miller Lite. Remember, it is a Miller Lite commercial. And then he sits down in the seat because these are great seats, and then the usher comes up to him and says, these are not your seats. Here comes the immortal line. Bob Uecker stands up, and he goes, I must have seats in the front row. And then the commercial last image is Bob Uecker sitting, you might remember, in the nosebleeds, all the way up in the upper corner of the stadium, all the way over the corner with no one around him except his Miller Lite and his baseball pennant. It's a wonderful indication of humility, the idea that you think you belong in one place and you find out you really are what shall cease. And that is a setup for today's parable, which is a dinner version of the baseball story that I just told you. And in the banquet, Jesus is always being invited to banquets, and the salient feature of the banquets he's being invited to, the wealthy are having them. Who else can afford to have a banquet, right? And only their wealthy friends are there, and the forgotten ones, the blind, the crippled, the lame, which he mentions at the end of the gospel, they are nowhere to be found. Later in St. Paul's ministry, the same thing will happen. When he visits the church in Corinth, who he praises greatly for starting the church and beginning to build it, when he comes back to visit, he learns there have been divisions among them, and the poor have been literally moved out to the sidelines, and that the best and the brightest, the wealthiest and most influential find themselves around the altar, and St. Paul condemns them for not behaving as Christ has behaved and not recognizing the need for humility. So from the earliest days, this has been an issue. Jesus, knowing he's attending another one of these banquets, tells a parable about someone who arrives at a banquet and sits in the seat of honor. And he says he'll have to be moved because someone more influential than he will arrive, and he'll have to move to what's left, which would be the lowest seat of the house, and he will be embarrassed. Then comes that phrase that we always have trouble with. He who is exalted will be humbled, and he who is humbled will be exalted. Now, we know we're supposed to take the lowest seat in the house, and we know we're supposed to be humbled, but how does that work in our crazy, mixed-up world? Once again, our scriptures point the way for us. Jesus will take the lowest seat in the house. It happens first and foremost when we celebrate Holy Thursday. In the liturgy, only one time each year do we celebrate the ritual washing of feet, right after the gospel. The gospel is John's gospel. It has Jesus at the Last Supper, and instead of the formula we're used to, take this all of you need it, this is my body, John handles that elsewhere in his gospel. What Jesus does at the table at the Last Supper is say that he must wash the feet of his disciples. And they're embarrassed. They don't want Jesus to do such a serving and humbling gesture. But Jesus kneels on the floor and insists unless he washes their feet, they will not have union with him. And so the ritual takes place, which we sort of reenact each year on Holy Thursday. Now, for a lot of people, it loses its significance. The idea we're supposed to be uncomfortable because our feet are being washed? No, that's not the idea, even if we are uncomfortable. I don't like it either. It is uncomfortable. It's simply not the point. The point is not for us to be uncomfortable. The point, which was lost on his disciples then, and too often lost on us, is that Jesus always takes the lowest seat in the house. You can't get any lower than he goes. Jesus, who is the Son of God, who of God's choice clothed in human flesh, that's the incarnation, came to redeem sinful humanity from its evil and from its sins. Only his innocent blood could do such a thing. He had to take the lowest seat in the house so that you and I could be saved. And every time we celebrate Eucharist, we are reminded, even in the symbolism and the ritual of it, it gets lost. Just like I think the ritual of Holy Thursday is lost if it's not carefully explained. In the Eucharist, once again, we are reminded that when Jesus was crucified, the most inglorious, the most horrifying, the most painful kind of death imaginable, that's so clearly him taking the lowest seat in the house. So that even if we're riddled with pain, many of us are with medical ailments and emotional ailments, or if we're riddled with poverty, a good number of us are, it's not enough to make ends meet, or just all the various different sorts of challenges that visit you and I every time in this life, I'm afraid they pale in comparison to martyrdom, to being crucified on a cross by Roman soldiers. That is as low as someone can go, and Jesus is always there because we are worth it. What I'm trying to say is that when the sacraments are celebrated, we are reminded that we are exalted. We need to be reminded of that also. Just as much as the symbolism of liturgy is lost on most of us, and the difficulty of being humble is rather clear to all of us, we miss the entire point that it is Jesus himself who takes the lowest seat, that he exalts us. Every time you receive a sacrament, Naomi Elizabeth is not really that cognizant of what's taking place. So she'll know when the water hits her head. But I mean, other than that, not really cognizant of what is taking place. Everyone else is being exalted without knowing they are. The language, if you listen carefully to the baptism, language is language of exaltation. It's talking about a child has become a child of God. It's showing the mechanism whereby God saves each and every one of us. His precious blood that was shed because he took the lowest seat in the house. And when you and I receive Holy Communion today, as I hope you will when we come forward, once again it's ritual and we can easily lose the point. And each time Jesus is taking the lowest seat in the house. The crucified and resurrected Lord is presented to us in the bread that has been consecrated into his body. And so the minister says, the body of Christ, and we say amen. We are accepting the gift of the humility of God, who lowered himself to a cruel, vicious, unnecessary death so that you and I could be exalted and have a chance for salvation. Of course, that does mean something for us. What do we do? We've already been saved, so why do we have to worry about humility? Why do we have to worry about all these other things that bother us? I'll answer that. The reason we have to worry, the reason why Jesus tells the parable, is that in our lives we will constantly find ourselves in a place where it would be good for us to be humble. He points out the divisions that racked first century Israel society, and guess what? Those same divisions are here. They're manifested in different ways. Skin color, nationality, income, position of influence, gender fluidity, sexual orientation. I'm missing some things. That's more than enough right there. And then all of our political divisions and everything else that comes under the sun. Then when we're confronted with that, you know what? We're at that banquet again. That's where we are. And you know what we want to do? We want to be in the place where we can be above all that division, or even better, not be around it at all so that we don't have to pay attention to it. And when we do that, we cease being a disciple of Christ. He says, do not give to those who will repay you. What's the point in that? He says, invite those who cannot repay you, and you will have done something. Now, I'm not going to get into this political issue other than to mention it, but the conversation going on about the forgiveness of student loan debt is surprising to me given the gospel this weekend. The consternation is somebody's getting something we didn't get, or we're paying for something that somebody else didn't pay for, which, by the way, is a misread of the act of forgiveness. Amazingly enough, politicians who called it out this week were revealed to have received much larger PPP loans. What hypocrites. And so all of us had this as part of our original sin. We get jealous when somebody has something. We always think that we don't have enough. That requires us to move to a place of humility. And I'm preaching to myself as much as I'm preaching to you. It is so difficult to be in that place. We almost avoid it at all costs. And the reason we do it is we think we're humbled enough already. Most of us suffer from low self-esteem, and we experience mentally, internally, all of that humility. And when we act out, we're simply trying to address this thing that haunts us. But we're going about it all the wrong way. By fostering division, by ignoring differences, by being cruel or separate from other people, by being indifferent to the plight of others who suffer or are worse than us, we only worsen our self-esteem. The answer, once again, is Eucharist. When we come forward to receive the body and blood of Christ, our God who created us gives us everything, holding absolutely nothing back. And he does it because we are worth it. There is no better statement of self-worth than the receiving of a sacrament where God humbles himself to the lowest so that we can be exalted. Perhaps it just turns out that the cheap seats, the nosebleed seats, the seats that aren't the seats of honor, well, they're the best seats in the house.